I love to fish, especially for bass. Hi, folks. I was just thinking, if bass eat bluegills, maybe we should fish with what bass love to eat. You ever notice how the best fishing ideas usually start with simple observations? More than once, I've caught a big largemouth bass, swung her into the boat, and before I could even unhook the jig, she coughed up a bluegill the size of my hand. Not a little one. I mean, I'm talking a full grown dinner plate bluegill. And I sat there just thinking, if bass eat bluegills, maybe we should fish with what they eat. Seems obvious, doesn't it? We spend hundreds of dollars on plastic swim baits shaped like bluegills. We buy crankbaits, painted sunfish patterns, and we throw jigs with green pumpkin, trailers because somebody told us that it looks kind of like a brim. But the real thing is swimming right under the boat. So the question becomes, is it legal? Can we fish with game fish to catch a game fish? That's one of those questions fishermen argue about, kind of like politics and religion. In some states, the answer is no. Game fish are protected and you can't use them as bait. But in other places, including here in Florida, bluegill are perfectly legal bait, provided you catch them by legal methods and stay within the size and bag limits. Perfectly legal, which almost makes you wonder why more bass fishermen don't do it. Maybe it feels too easy. Maybe it feels like cheating. Or maybe we just like to buy too much tackle. Because the truth is, big bass eat big meals. And nothing swims in a bass pond with more calories per bite than a big old fat bluegill. Bluegills are slow compared to shad, compared to golden shiners. And they tend to hover around their beds. They guard their nests. They hang around docks and grass edges. And they don't just pass through like bait fish. They live there. And bass know exactly where to find them. I got a real lesson last summer, right off the dock in my own backyard. We have a little lake back there, and a friend of mine comes over from time to time and likes to fish for the big bluegills, the copper nose that we have in the small pond. We throw bread or we throw floating fish food out, and the fish tend to come in droves, and they're pretty easy to catch. But while he was fishing on that particular day, he happened to catch one small bluegill. And since he had a bass fishing rod with him, he went ahead and tied on that small bluegill, hooked a float to the top of it, threw it out just beyond where all the bluegills were busting the surface. And we sat there, we talked for a bit, not thinking too much about it, when all of a sudden we looked up and we saw the float was gone. No warning, no nibble, just gone. After a pretty good fight, he managed to get the fish up on the shore. We had no net, and he certainly couldn't lift him up on the dock. So he just brought him right up on the shoreline, beached him, so to speak. I went into the garage and got a scale, brought it back, and we weighed this monster of a fish, just over 10 pounds. 10 pounds. And he caught it on a little bluegill. No fancy lure, no electronics, no sponsored tackle, just a bass eating what a bass eats. And that wasn't the only time I saw it happen. On another day, I was feeding the big bluegills floating pellets in the evening, and I like watching them eat because they come up and they make a pretty good splash. They really bust the water. And some of these copper nose are 9, 10 inches. I think the biggest we've caught is about 10 and a half, maybe 11 inches. Just about the size of a a frying pan. Anyway, I was tossing the food out, and I noticed that some of the fish were moving more to the one side than the other. And then all of a sudden, not a swirl, not a splash, but an explosion. And I mean, it was like somebody dropped a bomb. A huge bass had blown up on one of those big bluegills. A 9 or 10 inch filet mignon. It was like a wolf hitting a sheep. It happened so fast, the water barely had time to settle down and become quiet once again. And I remember thinking, that bass didn't come in for the pellets. She came in for the bluegills. Some biologists would tell you the bass don't necessarily prefer bluegills, but that they eat whatever's easiest, whatever's available, and what gives them the most energy for the least amount of effort. And a hand-sized bluegill is kind of like a cheeseburger with fries. And here's the funny part. Most of us already know that. We've seen it with our own eyes. That bass coughing up a bluegill on the carpet of our boat is about as honest a fishing report as you'll ever get. Or when we clean out our live well after we've had bass sitting in there all day. Maybe there's a combination of crawfish and bluegills, but there's no question that's the food they eat. And there's no marketing, there's no hype, there's no YouTube sponsor. That's just a bass telling us exactly what they've been eating and what they prefer to eat. And still, most of us just high on another lure. I've thought about this more than once, catching a couple bluegills maybe first thing in the morning, hooking one through the lip, flipping it out along the grass, and just waiting. Because if you really want to catch a 10-pound bass, you have to know what that 10-pound bass wants for lunch. And you might not find it hanging on a pegboard at the tackle store. You might just find it swimming under a float or in a minnow bucket, or right there along the edge of a bluegill bed where the water looks like it's boiling. Maybe bass don't have a favorite food. Maybe they just eat whatever's there. But I do know this. Every time a big bass spits a bluegill out on my deck, or I see a 10-pounder drag a float underwater, or I watch a giant bass blow up on a 9-inch coppernose, I can't help but think the bass have been telling us the answer for a long, long time. You see, fish eat what they eat, and they love bluegill. All I can tell you, folks, is give it a try. You might be surprised. Instead of spending $24 to $30 for golden shiners, you might find out that bluegills work just as well. Thanks for tuning in, folks. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.